Futurized goes beneath the trends, tracking the underlying forces of disruption in tech, policy, business models, social dynamics, and the environment. Join me, futurist Trond Arne Undheim, PhD author, investor, and serial entrepreneur, as I discuss the societal impact of deep tech such as AI, blockchain, IoT, nanotech, quantum, robotics, and synthetic biology, and tackle topics such as entrepreneurship, trends, or the future of work. I'm a research scholar in global systemic risk, innovation, and policy at Stanford University. On Futurized, I interview smart people with a soul, founders, authors, executives, and other thought leaders, or even the occasional celebrity. Futurized is a bi-weekly show preparing you to think about how to deal with the next decade's disruption so you can succeed and thrive no matter what happens. Futurized, conversations that matter. If you're new to the show, seek particular topics, or are looking for a great way to tell your friends about the show, we've got the episode categories. Those are at futurized.org/episodes. I am the co-author of Augmented Lean, a human-centric framework for managing frontline operation, and the author of Health Tech, Rebooting Society's Software, Hardware, and Mindset, Future Tech, How to Capture Value from Disruptive Industry Trends, Pandemic Aftermath, How Coronavirus Changes Global Society, The Disruption Games, How to Thrive on Serial Failure, and of Leadership from Below, How the Internet Generation Redefines the Workplace. For an overview, you can go to trondundheim.com/books. At this stage, Futurized is lucky enough to have several sponsors, and to check them out, go to futurized.org/sponsors. If you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or to get an overview of other services provided by me, including how to book me for keynote speeches, please go to futurized.org/store. We'll consider all brands that have demonstrably positive contributions to the future. Before you do anything else, make sure you are subscribed to our newsletter on futurized.org, where you can find hundreds of episodes of conversations that matter to the future. Please also leave a positive review on iTunes. Thanks so much.
Dana, welcome to the show. How are you?
Very well, thank you. It's nice to be here with you.
Yeah, this is exciting and frightening. We're going to talk about some of the most difficult things, but also some of the most wonderful things that humanity and nature has to offer. Dana, you are a psychologist, you're a futurist and also an author, and you write on lots of different topics, from digital altruism to, the anti-fragile mindset, rewilding the human psyche. These are very meaty topics, a little unfamiliar to some. You have worked with humanistic psychologists, and you have a degree. You have a PhD from Saybrook University, studying evolutionary systems design and various other things. Can you give me a sense of how you got where you are and what motivated your exploration of some of these topics that, perhaps today are really front of a mind for many people, unfortunately, but they weren't when you started?
Yes, that's right. Thank you. What motivated me when I was starting, and I was in a psychology program. I wasn't studying in a future studies program at the time, but it just turned out that the topics that I was interested in were kind of futuristic, or, as you point out, just hadn't been discussed much at the time when I started researching them. And digital altruism is a great example. And the reason I became interested in that is because I come out of a humanistic psychology background. And in that field, we're always looking at the highest potential of humanity, or the highest potentials, right? The best parts of us, the most well-functioning versus, the dis-ease or the disease model. And so at that time, there was a lot of conversation around the negative use of digital technology. In fact, like cyber crime, cyber bullying, a lot of just focus on the misuse. And so that made me interested to start to investigate the positive pro-social use of this technology. And I found a lot of people online using digital tools for good, kindness, altruism, and in fact, eventually a sort of new form of heroism. And so that's what led me in that direction. Initially was just sort of my background and training and the conversation at the time. Yeah. As far as the digital altruism piece, and then we can, I don't know, go into the others if you'd like.
Yeah, so I mean, there's many threads to pick up on. The way that I got to know you was through our Stanford Existential Risks Conference last year, and you presented a paper there on psychological fragility, but also paths towards anti-fragility and resilience. So we're eventually going to get there, but I guess I wanted to take a little detour on some of the wilder stuff that you're doing, and I mean
Okay.
that in the best possible way. We had a little pre-conversation about this, but this idea of tying to nature has been central to some of your most recent work, and I just wanted to take this detour a little bit on this concept of rewilding and the rewilding lab that you're now trying to establish. What is that? What is that about? And what is it about the relationship to nature that can bring us into this topic?
Well, it's an interesting segue, because I actually became interested in rewilding around the same time as the anti-fragility research that I did. And that's because I started that research during COVID. And one of the characteristics of the anti-fragile mindset was this ability to go out into nature and find solace and healing, and during stressful times. And so it just happened that I then started investigating the rewilding movement. And in most parlance, rewilding movement refers to the reclaiming of natural lands, wetlands, forestry, etc. And it just started to think about how much of our interiors are being lost in tandem with the external world. And that led me to think about, yes, how can we reclaim that part of ourselves? And for some of us who grew up maybe during a time when we had more ability to get outside, or we spent our youth and our childhood largely playing outside in the woods, or in some type of natural setting. To juxtapose that to youth growing up today who might not have as much opportunity to do so, both because of the loss of these wild lands and places, and also because of the prevalence of the use of technology, online gaming, and etc. And I don't have any problem with online gaming. It's just as we all know, let's say a young person or even adult, we have a limited amount of time in our day, and so how we spend it matters, not only for our own health, but then for our relationship with the planet. And that relationship informs whether or not we decide to act on the behalf of the environment.
Yeah, I just, when you're talking and when I was preparing for this, I was just reflecting a little bit. And, I think we all have different sort of upbringings. I mean, I grew up in Norway and did exactly what you said, meaning when I was certainly, in elementary school and earlier, there were several very specific, fairly small forested areas very close to my house, literally walking distance. And as I grew up, unfortunately, even, in Norway, a very sparsely populated place, interestingly, both of those particular two forest areas that I'm thinking about, the ones that were literally 5 minutes from my house, houses were built on it. So when you go back, those are not available anymore. And that couldn't actually be replaced by a park, even if somebody wanted to build it, because they were literally virgin forested areas, meaning nothing had ever been built on those. So when we were playing in those, and they weren't even large forests, but they were, let's consider it like perhaps one of them was a place where you could have, where there now is 10 houses, and another was perhaps somewhere where there's like 20 or 30 houses. So they're not like enormous forested areas, but one was very close to my elementary school, and the other was just a little sort of forest patch in between some of my best friends' houses. But I can still remember the feeling of playing in that forest. And I think something, apart from just the nostalgia, I think there was something there that I really don't think I could have gotten other places. I can still very distinctly remember very sensory experiences from playing in a natural environment like that.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting what you said reminded me of a story that, in fact, is probably one of the catalysts, buried up in my mind to some of this research. And that is, I'm in Arkansas, and I have a neighbor who is, well, this area is a suburb. However, there are still forested areas. For example, as you explained, you might have crossed through a forested area to get to your friend's house. So that's sort of the situation that still remains here in some pockets. I have a friend who moved here from London, in the UK, actually, and they were never exposed to these kind of forests. And they actually won't cross. They mow their grass, but like if they need to cross to get somewhere, they won't enter that patch of forest. They're actually afraid to enter that forest. And I mean, it's nothing but a very small patch of forested land, that hasn't been cleared. The underbrush hasn't been cleared. So sure, there are brambles in there. There might be a snake in there. There's definitely ticks in there. So I'm not saying there's nothing frightening in there, but the capacity and this is a grown man, mind you, that does not feel safe enough to walk into a forest behind his own home. And I think it's interesting to me that what is also lost inside of his imagination, for example. I mean, these are studies we need to do. I don't have the answers, but I have questions.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked into this particular practice. I wanted to just chat for a minute because I think it is incidentally relevant to what we're going to talk about in a minute. But in Japan, the Japanese Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries, basically in 1982, which now is a long time ago, apparently
Yes.
coined the term forest bathing, which is called Shinrin Ryoku in Japanese, and you're very familiar with it. Shinrin meaning forest and Yoku meaning bath, essentially. Now, when I encountered this term, for me, it's a little strange because, as someone who grew up with nature,
Yeah.
at least fairly, in fairly close proximity to it, forest bathing sounds a little contorted to me in the sense that
Yes.
I always walked around in nature. And when they then explain, and I was just reading a recent article, which, is wonderful. And it talks about how you should explore all five senses and, sense of sight, smell, hearing, touch, and taste. And you should basically, I guess, look at the landscape, smell the landscape, listen to the birds sing, touch the trees, and then eat the foods and fruits from the forest. Now, this sounds very structured to me, and I have been doing those things fairly naturally. But it seems that in Japan, it has become a medicinal approach to techno stress, urban stress, a lot of stressors. What is your view of this? Because in a second we'll get to this psychological fragility of our contemporary problems with existential risks and stuff. But just this basic idea of forest bathing, how do you relate to that practice?
Well, I agree, as you mentioned, that growing up, it was something that I more or less took for granted. And I guess looking back to what I said about my neighbor who's from London, it's obviously something they didn't take for granted. And as we know, Japan itself is a very metropolitan place for the most part. So therefore, I imagine that a lot of the youth are not growing up with the opportunities that you and I had. And so then comes this need to structure a medicinal, forest bathing into society. Um, and I think it's something we desperately need. It's unfortunate that we need it. It's unfortunate that we don't have enough wild places, that this is just not a common part of our daily life, that we couldn't structure life around the wild in a way that would be much more pleasant to live. But nevertheless, until at which time we have changed society over to have more wild places, then I think this is a wonderful practice. And in fact, I have found in working with individuals and groups that they really do benefit from this forest bathing practice, under whatever term one wants to use. Just actually having to remind people to use their senses, to get out of their head, because a lot of times someone might go outside and say, okay, well, I'm going to go outside. But even when they go outside, maybe they're carrying their troubles from the day with them. They're trying to problem solve. They're not actually relaxing. They're not actually letting the natural world in. And there's one writer, storyteller, Martin Shaw, who I really appreciate and whose work has really informed my own thinking. And he talks about how the natural world seeks to be appreciated by us, and that we actually have to stop and do that. So I think part of the thing with forest bathing is when we actually open our ears and listen to the sounds around us, then we have the possibility to appreciate that, to hear a bird, versus we are walking through and that's just peripheral noise. It's, and the same with all the rest of the senses, of course.
Yeah. No, what struck me, and I showed you this book before, but I have been reading this book, Forest Bathing, which is available on Amazon and everywhere, and it's there is particularly one researcher, Xing Li, I guess, who has been writing about forest bathing, and I just read one of his more academic articles just now from 2 years ago, where the claim is that it actually acts on human kind of killer cells and works on basically at a medicinal level, has
Yes.
real effect on things like depression, but potentially also more than just mood states. It literally, that's the next level of this sort of research. He is doing empirical research with patients on various diseases, including cancer and other things. And I do know that some hospitals do explore, using the outdoors as part of treatment for at least long-term patients, where
Yes.
you have time to pass, and the idea is a lot of it is psychological healing and stuff as well. So I found this interesting, but let me then use this as a segue, because you wrote this article, Existential Risk from Resilience to Anti-Fragility, for us at this event on existential risk. Can you just explain to us what made you write this? What is your biggest point there?
Sure.
If I were to paraphrase, you are saying something about the needed new mindset that you think generally needs to start developing. We have an increased set of risks, your paper says, and that poses fairly significant threats to the human psyche overall. And then you go on to write something about specific groups. And I think you write about children and elderly and other, threatened, psychologically more volatile groups in society. Can you explain what the paper was about and why this is a psychological sort of challenge?
Sure. Well, I became interested in this during COVID. I did some research on the character strengths that people were using during COVID to get through COVID. And that research led me more into the anti-fragility research. And, anti-fragility, for those who aren't familiar with it, is the ability to grow stronger under stressors. It was coined by Nicholas Nassim Taleb in his book on anti-fragility. And it's been applied to many different disciplines now. Psychology is one of the areas where it has not had a large uptake of interest. And I found it interesting, I guess, again, because of my background at looking at, the high functioning humans. And I think that the thing that struck me about the X risk was, that it's not just about survival, that it's about human potential. And so if we are, in fact, in, dire situations and we survive, that's wonderful. But what happens to our potential as a species, our creativity, our ability to flourish in the face of these crises? And so that was what made me interested in this research. And what the research covered really was looking at what kind of factors exist that are psychological risk factors for mental illness in the face of cascading global crises. And so I found that, in fact, there's quite a bit that exists. And I think you touched upon it. With women, there's like a 45% chance that they're going to have a pre-existing risk factor. That's because 1 in 3 women have already experienced violence in their lives. And all of these things add up so that in the case of another trauma, they're predisposed to, let's say, have a negative reaction to that trauma. And the same goes with children. They're usually more negatively affected by trauma. And so, anyway, all of these things added up to make me very interested in what the research was saying about those who actually thrive. And we call that, the post-traumatic growth. And so in psychology, that is an area that's had a significant a rather significant amount of research studying post-traumatic growth. And it feels to me that post-traumatic growth and anti-fragility are very similar. In post-traumatic growth, you have a subset of people who self-declare that they've actually grown stronger after a traumatic event, which is kind of, over time they find that they may have grown stronger. And that's very similar to this concept of anti-fragility. So therefore, what I was proposing in this article essentially is that we need to expand our spectrum of well-being to include all of these things: fragility, resilience, and anti-fragility. And that any person might experience any one of these things at any particular time. In other words, you could go through a crisis and feel very fragile, and then have moments of resilience, and then have anti-fragility. And so that was sort of a very quick nutshell version of the research.
Yeah, I was just trying to look up this because I know that one of the critiques against this notion of post-traumatic growth is that the scale for assessing it, there's one particular scale that assesses it. And like you pointed out, it is self-reported growth. So some people are sort of saying, well, that's not really a very solid assessment scale. Plus people's perceptions are prone to error. You might just sort of justify. You want to say to people that you grow from stress because that's a socially desirable thing to do. Yes, I overcome this process from my trauma, and I'm now stronger. It is actually kind of a trope, in human society to say that. How do we what is the next step there in order to validate this idea that is there any other way than self-reported? I mean, I guess you could look at people's objective success, like are they still gainfully employed? Do they have any sort of achievements? But it seems to me that it's great that people experience having that.
Yeah.
And you should listen to people, I guess, if
Yes,
you say, I feel good.
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it doesn't present solid evidence that they have truly grown in any meaningful way. So I'm just curious, when you read that research, do you swallow all of it, wholesale, or is there something there that we need to figure out?
I think that the most important part to figure out is that, we live in this society that wants everything to always be black or white, that doesn't like paradox at all, and that we know that paradox is in fact part of the future. It's part of now, but it's only going to become more so. There has to be both and I think that one reason that I felt like a spectrum approach was an appropriate approach is because I think that people, as you pointed out, maybe it's a trope. People think, oh, I should say that I feel better or stronger. However, it also can be that they do in that moment, but that doesn't mean that even in the same day, later on, they may have a moment where they feel very fragile. And so that what needs to be okay is that we can feel all of these things, and that anti-fragility is just on the scale of possibility, because right now we don't have the language to speak about these things. The general public doesn't know anything about post-traumatic growth. And the general public doesn't know anything about anti-fragility. So I think what I would like to see is that those ideas became more common, so that if someone did feel, okay, I'm doing well, maybe there was some growth out of that trauma I experienced, that they can also feel okay about that, and not like, oh, wait, maybe I shouldn't feel that way. In other words, if we don't have a classification or words for this idea, then people may find themselves struggling with even feelings of guilt if they feel like they grew from trauma. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that is very interesting. Do you think people actually think that they shouldn't feel okay?
I think it's certainly, yes, possible and very probable. I mean, the human psyche is very complex and um, deep, and people feel lots of feelings simultaneously.
Right. So psychological risk is obviously it's a feeling, but it's also related to the existence of objective stress factors. And when you were looking into existential risk, and when we all are faced with, there's this term out there now of polycrisis, right, which Cambridge
Yes.
Dictionary says is a time of great disagreement, confusion, or suffering caused by many different problems happening at the same time, so that they together have a very big effect. Now,
Yes.
that's a sort of generic statement that it has a very big effect. You seem to be particularly worried about the psychological effect, because one thing is, we think we want to try to fix all these things, and politicians and others are obviously struggling because there's so many things going on, from, I guess, climate change to wars in various regions of the world. And then there's all the avalanche of new technologies that are coming in with obviously great opportunity, but also techno stress or even adverse consequences if we don't contain them, so that there's potential runaway effects and whatnot. And these are potentially real things that could affect all of us or some of us, but you were saying they would affect some people much more than others. Now, what do you make of that? Let's assume that these risks are indeed multiplying and kind of cascading and increasing. What is the effect of that as you are observing it now? So there's more crises that will essentially lead predisposed people, women,
Hmm.
children, elderly, and also those who have experienced trauma in the past, to perhaps feel it even stronger. Um, But it's one thing to say that as a psychologist that would treat one person or two people or have 20 in your practice.
Mhm.
What do you think the implications are more on a grander sort of societal scale? I guess that's what I wanted to discuss a little bit. If this indeed is true, the stressors
Yes.
are just increasing and increasing. Wouldn't eventually this just become a problem that you can't just solve by? I mean, there's presumably wouldn't be enough psychologists eventually
Ex-
to deal with this.
Precisely, and I think that the thing is, that's why I think of the psychological risk as a very serious risk. If people are unhealthy psychologically, if their mental health, if they feel broken, they're not going to be able, or they're less likely to be able to rebuild, let's say, communities after disasters. And as we're talking about multiple poly crises happening at one time, people have to or should be starting from if everything's lost and all they have is themselves, right? Then if they're starting from a place of psychological strength, then that's what they can use to move forward. If they're starting from a place of psychological fragility, then how do they move forward? And as you point out, there's not going to be in most cases a team of mental health professionals around to support them. And I'll say one of the areas that is really worrisome about this. It's all connected together. Is if you go back to COVID, the main support that we had was our technological support system. Right, more mental health professionals were online than ever, and people were using the internet for work, for school, for therapy, for entertainment. And so one of the major concerns is, in times of polycrisis, we're likely to lose connectivity. We are highly likely to not be able to sit and have a conversation like we are today. And so then people only have what they have around them. They can't ask Siri or Google or anyone to answer their questions for them, right? Even basic things like how do I start a fire, much less how do I get mental health. And so, yeah, I think that we need to be fortifying the psyche to be strong enough to handle this these kind of situations.
So I find that tremendously interesting. Fortify the psyche. Now, I've heard this before, as this is an advice I guess every psychologist would individually give to people. But how do you do that collectively? And is that even possible? Has it been tried? If you think about, I mean, have there been public health campaigns in any country that have done this? Because there are countries that have experienced traumatic events before, where parts of their country has been subjected to, I don't know, genocide, other very, very serious
Yeah.
situations. Do you know of any situation where this has been addressed at any meaningful scale beyond sort of the individual and group level? Because clearly, like traumatic psychology after like a ferry incident, or like at the
Yeah.
Zeebrugge incident in the 80s, where I guess 193 people died. There was a psychology service available, and this was heavily publicized. There are other sort of crisis type things where you have earthquakes and things, and I guess COVID would perhaps be the biggest event where there must be now an emerging set of research on how the mental health profession responded to that sort of macro crisis. But what generally what can you do? I mean, we did talk about one thing, forest bathing. What are the things you would say as a civilization would be a fruitful fortification, a kind of a mitigation strategy for this potential futuristic problem?
Well, I agree that it's very difficult to reach a lot of people, particularly in our society today, because we are all in these silos, and public health campaigns or public service campaigns don't reach the wide net that they once did. the ones that I remember, growing up. Everyone else knew about because they were all watching the same programs, or one or the other station. I think that, what we can do is spread awareness. I think educators, policymakers, anyone who works with other people, the things that need to be highlighted to help fortify the psyche and promote this type of an anti-fragility are, as we talked about, active engagement with the natural world. And so shoring up ways for people to interact with nature. Um, and also, character strengths are one of the things that I found in my research from the COVID pandemic, and also I have seen in the post-traumatic growth that oftentimes people cite their character strengths were what helped them get through. So those could be, more part of curricula, and also anticipatory thinking. So during COVID, more people were thinking ahead, planning ahead. So that's another aspect and element. And then flexible personal narratives. And so that was another piece of research that came out of COVID, is people were willing to change, to work from home, to move locations. They were opening up to a less rigid way of living, and having this kind of flexibility. So those four things are some of the major components that employers can add to their human resources, education. Educators of any kind can bring these into what they're sharing with students. Those are the top things so far that I have found.
So if we then move a little bit to the future, and we assume that many more stresses will indeed start to occur in a relatively short time frame, meaning in your and my lifetime, the stresses just seem to be packing on, and we don't have to create any very tangible scenario for this to be true. But if you just think about climate change, it's becoming a very pressing concern. But even beyond that, just the climate events that many more people are experiencing even just right now, if you just amplify them a little bit and assume that it's going to get worse as opposed to better, and you can maybe just think about some of the geopolitical things going on as well, and there that goes up and down, and geopolitics could improve. But what do you think is going to happen? Is there a threshold by which this is going to become an enormous issue that would have to be basically addressed by policymakers in order to even just survive as a functional society
Yeah.
or country or group? Or are we talking just coping for people who kind of fall to the wayside?
No, I think, if I didn't say it clearly, I think we should already have policymakers in creating policy around these areas. Many places are already experiencing a lot of impacts from climate change. We have refugees around the world from ongoing wars. We already need to be. We're behind. It's not something that needs to be the future. It needs to have been done yesterday. And since it wasn't done yesterday, then certainly we have this pressing need today, and going forward, to address these things.
Mm-hmm. What about as at an individual level? I mean, some of my listeners are, most of them are adults, but different ages, and you might want to deploy some of these strategies yourselves, or with your family, or even just in your friend groups, and smaller maybe people who own companies can
Yes.
implement some of these. But what is the starting point to this anti-fragile mindset more generally? So you lined up some strategies, these four things here. How do you best start with that individually?
I think the best place to start is to, well, recognize that this ability exists within us. So just to acknowledge, I have the ability to be anti-fragile, to teach people in your family that they have that ability. It's sort of like a fortitude, but it's a fortitude that goes beyond just fortitude, because it's actually a creative strength, I would say. And interestingly enough, creativity was the character strength that kept coming up time and time again in the COVID research as what people were relying on. So I would say to those who are interested, first off, get outside, get your families outside, follow some of these practices. Like we talked about earlier on, the forest bathing practices, getting a relationship with nature that goes beyond taking a walk through the park, that you're actually communing with, the natural world, because it shores us up in ways that we're not fully clear about right now. I think you mentioned a lot of research is going on in environmental medicine and environmental psychology. We're finding out more all the time about our interdependence and relationship with nature and how it heals us. And that's mentally, physical, across body, mind, spirit. And so those were, the top places I would say. Engage in creative thinking, and get outside.
So just to be specific here, you are talking about much more than the exercise effect, right? You're not talking about plainly just be outside and exercise.
Oh, yeah, no.
You're talking about a much more active.
Yes. A much more forest bathing experience.
Right.
Not just getting physical, exercise. You can do that on,
You can
an exercise machine.
Exercise machine, yeah, right. Yeah. But so maybe there is a reason then, why the Japanese have introduced this term and a structured practice. You think potentially that would be an example of things that are going to go more worldwide. It's going to become much more of a true structured practice. This idea of not just exercising and liking to be outside and thinking that's a good thing, but in a structured way, almost as medicine. Think of nature as truly a potential for healing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, it's a very interesting world we're moving into. I fear, however, though, that like we explored, because the need is greater, it also means that this must surely become harder and harder to do. Or do you think that we have this innate potential to, as a human race, just find ways out of this? I guess my last question here is, are you optimistic or pessimistic that people more generally and also specifically vulnerable groups will find ways to deal whatever happens, whatever world we're entering now?
It seems, based on, historical context, that people usually do find ways through even the most devastating situations. I do feel like, we're moving towards some that are quite a bit more destructive in the sense of the cascade effect than what people have experienced in the past. But I'm an optimistic person, so I would have to say that I do think we'll find a way. Yeah.
Well, that's a good way to end. I think we should find a way. I thank you for this, open-ended discussion on psychological fragility and the implications of increasing existential risks. Thank you so much, Dana.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it.
You have just listened to another episode of the Futurized podcast with me, Trond Arne Undheim, futurist, scholar, and author. If you are interested in my products or services, feel free to check out futurized.org/store, where you can book a keynote speech, become a sponsor or partner, request a podcast swap, or buy a few of my books, such as Augmented Lean, Health Tech, Future Tech, Pandemic Aftermath, Disruption Games, or Leadership from Below. If you're interested in any or all of my projects, check out my website, trondundheim.com, which has links to other podcasts as well as my public appearances. Thank you. Please share this show with those you care about. To find us on social media is easy. We are Futurized on LinkedIn and YouTube, and Futurized 2 on Instagram and Twitter. See you next time. Futurized, conversations that matter.